Set the stage. What did cold mean in medieval Europe? How harsh were winters without insulation, central heating, or modern clothing? Introduce the lived reality of peasant life and outline why this question matters, not just about temperature, but survival, community, and ingenuity. Mention how this story unfolds in different corners of medieval Europe. Let Seps begin with a scene. It's midwinter. You're standing in a one-room wooden hut, walls stuffed with straw, no insulation, no glass on the window, just a wooden shutter. Outside, a cruel wind rolls across the snow-covered fields. Inside, the air stinks of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. There's a fire burning barely, and it's the only source of heat. You, your spouse, 3 children, and maybe even a grandmother are all pressed together on a bed of straw near the hearth. The dog is curled up in the corner. Everyone's wearing everything they own, and you're still cold. This was normal life for millions of medieval peasants, and somehow they survived. But how? That's what this episode is about. Not the wars, or the kings, or the castles, but the raw, unglamorous, unrelenting grind of staying alive in the freezing dark when you had almost nothing. When winter wasn't a season, it was a test. Why winter was a real threat. Before we romanticize this too much, let's be clear. Winter in medieval Europe was deadly. It wasn't just the cold, it was what the cold triggered. Food shortages, illness, isolation, exposure. The freeze could kill outright, sure, but more often, it weakened. It made your children more likely to starve, your wounds less likely to heal, your lungs more likely to give out. The average medieval peasant didn't have central heating, thermal underwear, or even a second pair of shoes. Many didn't own blankets. Their homes were porous, their diets thin, and their bodies overworked. And yet, winter came every single year, and somehow, most survived it. We are going to find out how. The landscape of cold. Not all winters were equal. A peasant living in 13th century southern France experienced winter very differently from one in 9th century Denmark. In the mountainous regions of Germany or the moors of northern England, things could get truly brutal. Sub-zero temperatures, deep snowdrifts, howling winds. Climate historians sometimes refer to the medieval period, roughly 500–1500 CE, as a time of microclimates. Europe went through warm periods and cold spells, floods and droughts. But one thing was consistent: peasants had to adapt with very little. They didn't have weather forecasts. They read the sky, watched the birds, and remembered the stories of their elders. They knew when a bitter season was coming, not from a calendar, but from the way the trees moved in October, or how fast the first frost came. Who were the peasants? Let Seps be clear about who we Sep they're talking about. Peasant isn't one type of person. It's a broad label covering anyone who worked the land but didn't own much of it. Some peasants were relatively secure. They might have had a good patch of land, some livestock, and even hired help. Others were barely surviving, serfs bound to the land, day laborers, or the rural poor scraping by on whatever they could glean after harvest. But most had one thing in common: no access to luxury, no access to comfort, no access to escape. And when winter hit, their ability to survive didn't come from money or gear. It came from knowledge passed down over generations. Tricks, rituals, communal habits, quiet resilience. Why this story matters. Why spend 3 hours talking about how peasants kept warm? Because this is history from below. The history of ordinary people doing the most human thing imaginable, trying to keep their families alive another night. This isn't the story of great inventions or royal decrees. This is the story of sleeping in shifts so the fire wouldn't die, of layering lice-ridden wool and praying it wouldn't snow again, of boiling onion soup for the 10th day in a row because it was all you had, of curling up next to a goat because it was warmer than the floor. And let's be honest, this kind of thing is easy to overlook. We're used to history being big, wars, crowns, inventions, but most of human life, for most of human history, has been small, local, physical, cold. This episode is a look at that side of things. So, what you're about to hear is a series of stories, not legends or fables, but grounded reconstructions of what life was like for medieval peasants trying to survive the long, cold nights. Each one dives into a different aspect of winter survival: the fire and the hearth, the food they ate to stay warm, the clothes they wore and patched, the beds they slept in and shared, the community tactics that got them through, the care they gave or couldn't give to the vulnerable, even how they used animals as living heaters. You won't hear much excitement, no dramatic battles, no plot twists, just the slow, careful, unremarkable work of not dying in the dark. And somehow, that might be the most human story of all. Before a fire could be lit, something had to burn. And for a medieval peasant, finding fuel in the dead of winter was often the hardest, most exhausting part of staying warm. Let's talk about wood. Firewood was the gold standard of heating fuel. Dry, dense, easy to store and control. But here's the thing. Most peasants didn't have access to forests, at least not legally. Much of the woodland across medieval Europe was owned by lords, monasteries, or the crown, and these weren't just private holdings, they were actively protected. Cutting down trees, or even gathering fallen branches, could get you fined, beaten, or worse. If you were lucky, your local lord allowed some gathering rights. Often this meant estover rights, a legal term for collecting certain materials like sticks, brambles, or deadwood from a nearby forest. But even then, you had to follow rules. No chopping, no removing bark, no touching the trees that were still standing. So in practice, getting enough wood to make it through winter meant endless walking, scouring ditches and hedgerows, and sometimes breaking the rules. And peasants absolutely did break the rules. Especially in the lean years, people would sneak into forests at dusk, dragging back what they could carry. Children were often sent out too. They were smaller, faster, and less likely to be punished harshly. A bundle of twigs could mean the difference between sleeping and shivering. Then there were the manorial forests, where game was protected for noble hunting. Stealing wood, there wasn't just a property crime, it was poaching. People were executed for it. But still, some risked it. The choice was simple: freeze or break the law. Turf, dung, and everything else. Of course, not everyone lived near trees. In parts of Ireland, Scotland, and the English fens, peat or turf was the go-to fuel, dug from bogs, dried in stacks, and burned slowly. Peat didn't give off much flame, but it gave long-lasting heat, and it was often free. If your village had rights to the common bog, you could dig your winter supply over the summer. Then there was animal dung. collected, shaped into patties, and left to dry on walls or thatched roofs. When burned, it smelled horrible, but it kept the cold away. Cow dung was best, but horse and pig droppings were used too. There's evidence that in some places, entire families depended on dung fires as their main source of heat. Crop waste helped as well. In harvest season, peasants gathered straw, chaff, and husks to dry and burn in winter. Even weeds and brambles, bundled tightly and dried, could be used to get a flame going. Nothing was wasted. If it smoked and smoldered, it had value. The labor of warmth. Here's what's easy to forget today. For medieval peasants, warmth wasn't a given. It was a job. A full day's labor might go into finding enough fuel for a single night. That meant less time for everything else. Less time for spinning, mending, cooking, praying. In bad winters, the family split up. Older children gathered twigs, parents cut turf, and the elderly guarded the embers at home. And just because you found fuel didn't mean it was good. Wet wood smoked, moldy straw sparked. Dung fires were hard to keep lit. If the fire died in the middle of the night, someone had to get up and restart it. If you ran out of kindling during a snowstorm, you were in trouble. There were no thermostats, no knobs to turn. Every flicker of heat was fought for. Seasonal hoarding and clever tricks. Some families planned ahead. In autumn, they'd stockpile whatever they could get. Wood was stacked along the outer wall. Peat bricks were stored under cover. Straw was bundled and tied. And to stretch fuel longer, peasants used some clever tricks. They'd bank the fire at night, bury the hot coals in ashes to keep them smoldering until morning. They used charcoal when they could afford it to get a hotter burn with less smoke, and they reused everything. Half-burnt logs were pulled from the ashes, dried, and used again. In some areas, clay balls were heated in the fire and placed in beds or under cloaks. Old metal tools were heated and wrapped in cloth. Even rocks could be used to hold warmth through the night. Some tricks were communal. Villagers who had access to a large bread oven might share the residual heat after baking. Children were sent to warm themselves by the kiln before bed. In this world, every calorie of heat mattered. When there was nothing, but of course, not everyone could plan. In poor harvest years, when fuel was scarce, or if someone got sick and couldn't gather, the fire simply didn't burn. People huddled closer. They used body heat. They didn't undress at night. Blankets, when they existed, were shared. In some cases, families crowded into the homes of relatives just to share warmth. You might sleep sitting up, arms around your knees, with your back against the hearth, too close to be safe, but better than freezing. The records mention frostbite and winter deaths, even inside peasant homes. Infants and the elderly were most at risk. One brutal winter could wipe out entire hamlets. And yet, even in those worst years, most survived, not because they were stronger, but because they knew the rhythms of the land, the habits of preparation, and how to stretch nothing into something. The hearth was the center of a peasant's home, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and practically. It was the first thing you saw when you walked into the cottage. It was where meals were cooked, tools were dried, children were warmed, clothes were mended, prayers were whispered, and people gathered when the world outside turned to ice. But what most modern people forget is this: the fire didn't just happen. Every single day, it had to be built, carefully, intentionally, and with very limited supplies. Let's break down what that looked like. Ashes first, not last. A medieval peasant's fire didn't start from scratch every morning. Instead, it continued. The embers from the night before were buried deep in a bed of ash, not by accident, but on purpose. This was called banking the fire, and it was absolutely essential. At night, once everyone had eaten and the chores were done, the fire was raked down, coals spread out, and covered with a layer of fine ash. It looked like the fire was dead, but underneath, the embers smoldered slowly. In the morning, someone, usually the mother or eldest daughter, would scrape back the ash, find the still glowing coals, and carefully build a new flame around them. Why not just relight it from nothing? Because making fire from scratch was hard. Medieval homes didn't have flint lighters or matches. If the embers went cold, someone had to use flint and steel, or worse, a fire drill to start a spark. It could take forever. So if your coals went out, your whole morning got delayed. Keeping that little ember alive was as important as keeping a loaf of bread or a cup of water. It was life. The daily fire routine. Mornings were built around fire. You'd rise before sunrise, especially in winter, while the cottage was still dark and freezing. You'd kneel on the dirt floor, scrape away the ash, and gently blow the embers until they glowed red. Then you'd add kindling, tiny bits of dry twig, bark, or straw. If you were lucky, you had a bundle set aside. If you weren't, you'd shred old cloth or dried weeds. The flame would catch slowly, flickering, barely strong enough to light a candle. Then came fuel, something bigger. Maybe split logs, maybe peat, maybe dried dung. You'd stack it carefully, feed it gently, and guard it while it built up. One mistake, one puff of wind, and it might go out. Then you'd have to start again. During this whole time, your breath smoked in the cold air. Your fingers were numb. Your children were still huddled in the straw, and nothing else, no food, no warmth, no chores, could start until that fire caught. The smoke problem. Medieval peasant homes didn't have chimneys. At best, they had a hole in the roof. At worst, the smoke just gathered under the thatch and slowly drifted out through cracks. So every fire filled the room with smoke, thick, eye-stinging, throat-clogging smoke. And yet, this was considered normal. The blackened rafters, a sign of age, and warmth. The cough, a small price to pay for not freezing. Interestingly, some historians believe the constant smoke helped preserve the roof, coating it in soot and deterring pests. It may also have helped with sanitation in an indirect way, keeping bugs and fleas at bay. Still, it wasn't pleasant. Families lived in a constant haze. Children grew up with smoke in their lungs. Elderly peasants often developed what we'd now call chronic bronchitis, but nobody questioned it. That's just what winter warmth looked like, keeping it going all day. Once the morning fire was burning, it had to be maintained. That meant someone, usually the women or older children, checked it constantly. Too hot? You risked burning the meal or wasting fuel. Too cold? The flame would die, and you'd have to start over. The fire couldn't be left unattended for long. Going to the field? Someone stayed behind. Working in the garden? You ducked in to poke it every hour. Rainy day? You spent it chopping and drying wood, because if the firewood got wet, you were in trouble. Even meals revolved around the fire. Peasants didn't have ovens. They cooked in the fire, Using iron pots, pans, and clay jars, they hung pots on hooks or set them on tripods in the coals. Everything, soups, porridges, stews, was slow cooked. It simmered all day while the fire was tended. There was no such thing as a quick bite in winter. The fire was both your kitchen and your furnace. Fire as ritual and comfort. By evening, the fire took on a different meaning. The work was done. The sun had vanished. The outside world was cold and dark, and so the family gathered by the hearth, not just to warm up, but to reconnect. They told stories, said prayers, mended clothes, sorted grain, held each other. The fire's flicker was the only light, its crackle the only sound. In many ways, this was the peasant version of modern relaxation. No books, no music, just firelight and voices. And for all its smoke and danger, the hearth became a place of comfort, of memory, of life. Some medieval homes even had small household rituals, like tossing in salt for protection or drawing marks in the ash to ward off bad dreams. Fire was practical, yes, but it was also sacred. In some villages, they never let it go out. The hearth had to stay lit as a symbol of the home's spirit. If the fire died completely, it meant bad luck, or worse. When fires went wrong, of course, fire was also a risk. Peasant homes were built of wood, thatch, and mud. A runaway flame could take down a house in minutes, and if the wind was wrong, the whole village. That's why winter fires were always watched. That's why embers were buried before bed. That's why children were taught, from the earliest age, never to play near the hearth. Burn injuries were common, so were smoke inhalation and accidents with boiling pots. But again, this was the trade-off. Warmth came with danger, and yet, despite the risks, most families made it work, not because they had great tools or ideal fuel, but because they understood fire deeply. It wasn't a button you pushed. It was a living thing. You had to feed it, protect it, respect it. In the end, fire building wasn't just survival. It was a daily act of care, a rhythm, a ritual, a skill passed from mother to daughter, father to son, generation to generation. And if you couldn't master it, you wouldn't last the winter. So the fire is finally lit. The meal is eaten. The pot's been scraped clean. You fed the animals, bolted the door, and banked the coals under a soft bed of ash. Now comes the last challenge of the night, sleeping. And in a medieval peasant home, sleep wasn't exactly peaceful, but it was built around one thing, the hearth. The layout of a peasant sip's night. Most peasant homes were a single room, no bedrooms, no corridors, no privacy. Everything eating, cooking, storage, births, deaths, and sleep happened in that one space, and the warmest spot in the room always right next to the fire. So who got it? Usually the children, especially babies, toddlers, and the sick. Older adults often placed themselves around the perimeter, acting as a buffer between the fire and the coldest walls. The very old grandparents, invalids, might sleep closer in if they couldn't regulate their body temperature. And sometimes sleeping spots were earned. Whoever had chopped wood that day, or walked 10 miles to gather kindling, or worked the hardest in the freezing field, they might be given the warmest spot as a matter of fairness. But most nights, the whole family simply clumped together in a loose circle around the hearth, like animals in a den. Huddling wasn't just emotional, It was a biological tactic to conserve heat. What they slept on. Forget feather beds or pillows. Most peasants slept on straw, either piled loosely or stuffed into rough linen sacks. Some households raised the straw mattress on a wooden frame, but many just spread it on the packed dirt floor. Over time, straw would rot, flatten, and attract bugs, so it had to be changed regularly, though often wasn't. For blankets, they used whatever they had: patched wool cloaks, animal skins, even sacks. Most couldn't afford woven sheets or dyed fabrics. Layering was the strategy. Multiple thin layers did more than one thick one, especially if each was shared. And yes, peasants often slept fully dressed. Even in summer, they kept a layer on. In winter, they wore everything: cloak, tunic, head wrap, sometimes even shoes. Changing clothes before bed, that was a luxury for the rich and dangerous for the poor. Family dogs and livestock. A lot of homes included a dog, not as a pet, but as a worker, a watchdog, and in winter, a living heater. Dogs curled up beside children, licked faces clean in the morning, and warned of intruders. Their body heat made a real difference on the coldest nights. Same goes for cats, though they were often more valued for keeping rats away than providing warmth. And in some regions, livestock slept indoors. Chickens roosted in corners. Pigs were penned by the door. Even goats or calves might be brought in during extreme cold, especially if they were valuable or newborn. Their body heat helped warm the home. But the trade-off? Noise, smell, fleas, disease. Still, most peasants didn't see this as unsanitary. They saw it as normal, practical, efficient. In many cases, bringing animals indoors was the reason the family could survive the night. Noisy, broken sleep. Here's the thing: medieval sleep wasn't like modern sleep. For one, it was noisy. The fire crackled, the wind howled, dogs scratched, children snored, someone always had a cough, livestock shifted and clucked, and on especially cold nights, someone would get up to tend the fire or check that the coals hadn't gone out. For another, it wasn't continuous. Historians believe most medieval people slept in two chunks, what we now call first sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for a few hours, wake around midnight for an hour or two, and then drift back to sleep until dawn. The waking period was used for quiet conversation, stoking the fire, praying, tending to children, or even going outside to use the latrine. It was normal, expected, and part of the rhythm of life. Also, you never really got used to the cold. People fell asleep, shivering. They woke up with numb fingers. They rolled toward the fire, then rolled back when the smoke stung their eyes. It was aesthetic cozy. It was functional. The fire as guardian. Despite the discomfort, there was real comfort in the fire. It gave light in total darkness. It gave warmth when the wind shrieked outside. It kept rats and spirits away, or so people believed. In many homes, a fire was never allowed to go fully out, even during the day. A cold hearth was a sign of bad luck. A dead hearth was like a dead heart. There were rituals around this. In some villages, families would draw a circle in the ash before sleep to protect against evil. In others, they'd whisper a blessing into the coals or toss in a pinch of salt or herbs. Superstition blended into habit, and habit became survival. The hearth wasn't just a place to cook. It was the soul of the household. What if you had no fire? It happened. Fires went out. Fuel ran out. The weather turned worse than expected. When that happened, people got desperate. They might walk to a neighbor's home with an ember in a pot. They might sleep in shifts, rubbing hands together all night. They might light tallow candles, not for light, but for warmth. Even a single flame gave hope. In some cases, people migrated, not far, just to another cottage or barn where warmth was more likely. Friends and relatives packed in together. Strangers were sometimes let in too, not out of generosity, but necessity. More bodies meant more warmth. That was the math. And when none of that worked, they prayed to saints, to Mary, to the weather, to anything. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did instead. The next morning, when the rooster crowed and the sky began to gray, sleep ended. People rose stiff, sore, and cold. They shook out their cloaks, poked the coals, and started the entire cycle again. Scrape the ash, blow the embers, find the kindling, feed the fire. Life around the hearth was never done. And while no one would call it easy or idyllic, it was deeply human. Families stayed alive through warmth, routine, cooperation, and stubbornness. The hearth wasn't just a fire, it was the only defense between life and cold, between dark and light, between death and another day. When we think about staying warm in winter, we usually picture fires, blankets, maybe a cozy drink. But for medieval peasants, food itself was a weapon against the cold, and not just any food, hot, heavy, slow-burning fuel for the body. Let's just start with the basics. The peasant diet, winter edition. The average peasant diet was built around grains, mostly barley, rye, or oats, depending on the region. Wheat was rare and reserved for the rich. Bread was eaten at nearly every meal, but in winter, it wasn't enough. Cold weather called for wet, warm, dense food, which meant pottage. Pottage was more than a meal. It was a lifestyle, a thick stew of grains, water, vegetables, and whatever else you could scavenge. Pottage simmered over the hearth for hours, sometimes days. You added to it when you had something, stretched it when you didn't, and shared it because it was too much effort not to. And here's the thing, it worked. Warm food filled your belly, helped you retain body heat, and gave you the energy to do hard labor in the cold. The warming foods. Medieval people didn't think in terms of calories or metabolism. They thought in terms of humors, an old medical belief that balanced heat, moisture, dryness, and cold in the body. Certain foods were believed to warm you from the inside. Here are a few that showed up most often: onions and leeks, cheap, easy to grow, and believed to be heating. Garlic, used for both warmth and health. Peasants ate it raw or stewed into pottage. Beans and lentils, heavy, filling, and warming. They were the meat of the poor. Ale and beer, low alcohol, but consumed warm and in quantity. Liquid bread, basically. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and beets were stored underground and eaten all winter. Cooked slowly, they kept people full. Spices were rare for peasants, but in some areas, wild herbs like mustard seed, horseradish, or wild garlic added bite and heat. And when things were really good, maybe a bit of pork fat or a bone to boil, not meat, exactly, but enough to enrich the broth and feel like luxury. the role of fat, and fat was precious, not just for calories, but for warmth. In winter, animal fat from pigs, geese, or even cows was stored carefully. It was rendered into lard, used to fry food, and eaten in small spoonfuls. Lard was rubbed on bread, used in stews, and sometimes smeared on hands or lips to protect from the cold. Nothing was wasted. When a pig was slaughtered in the fall, every part was used. Meat was salted and smoked, bones were boiled for stock, and fat was rendered and saved. A home that had a crock of lard in the winter was better off than most. And for the truly poor, they bought scraps of suet or marrow from the butcher if they could afford it. If not, they made do with boiled grains and the memory of meat, food as heat storage. Here's where instinct met science. Long before people knew the science, hot food keeps you warm longer. Meals were eaten hot whenever possible. Even if you had only a crust of bread, you dipped it in hot broth. If you had ale, you molded with a hot poker. Cold porridge was tolerated, but warm porridge was a miracle. In some regions, peasants carried hot stones wrapped in cloth to warm their hands at meals. Others used heated mugs or bowls as hand warmers before eating. Children might huddle near the pot just to get the steam, and once the meal was over, the warmth lingered. That full belly of pottage might be the only thing standing between you and frostbite during the walk to the field. Special foods for special days. Even in the dead of winter, the medieval calendar was full of feast days, religious holidays that punctuated the monotony. On these days, peasants often splurged. If they had meat, they ate it. If they had cheese, it came out. Holiday meals were about community warmth as much as food. Neighbors might pool resources, share an animal, bake a larger loaf. It wasn't just celebration, it was insulation, emotionally and physically. Even poor parishes tried to distribute extra food to the neediest during cold seasons. Churches gave out bread, soup, or ale as alms. Monks made stews. Lords made a show of feeding the poor, though more for prestige than generosity. Still, it helped, and will could extend a life by another day. And in medieval winter, that was enough. Water, wine, and warm drinks. Water was dangerous. Wells could freeze, rivers were polluted, and cold water chilled the body from within. So peasants drank ale, mild, often weak, and brewed at home. In winter, they drank it warm. Sometimes it was spiced, heated, mixed with honey. If you were very lucky, you might get mulled wine, especially near Christmas. This wasn't peasant fare, exactly, but monasteries and wealthier households sometimes handed out mugs of it to villagers. In rural areas, people made herbal infusions, hot drinks brewed with nettle, mint, or wild flowers. Not quite tea, but the same idea, and the warmth alone was medicine. Food wasn't set just fuel. It was hope. Imagine working outside all day in icy mud, fingers numb, face raw from wind, and the only thing getting you through it is the thought of hot soup waiting at home. That's what food was. Not comfort in the modern sense, but purpose. It gave shape to the day heat to the body and something to look forward to. And even when ingredients ran low, peasants got creative. They used stale bread as a thickener. They made broth from bones used 3 times already. They chewed boiled roots until they turned sweet. They fed their children first. They watered down their meals to stretch them one more day. Because if you could eat hot food tonight, you might live to eat it tomorrow. Let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval winters could, and often did, kill, especially if you were poor, landless, or unlucky with the harvest. And when food ran out, it didn't happen all at once. Starvation came slowly, in stages, and it shaped everything from behavior to belief. So, what happened when the pot was empty? The lean times between feast and famine. The most dangerous time wasn't always the dead of winter. It was the months just before the next harvest, late winter, and early spring. That's when stores were lowest, but planting hadn't yet paid off. It even had a name, the hunger gap. Grain bins were scraped clean. Salt meat had long been eaten or gone rancid. Vegetables had either been consumed or rotted. Chickens stopped laying in the cold. Milk dried up when cows were lean, and so people turned to whatever they could find. Foraging and desperation. If you think foraging means some quaint walk through the woods, think again. Winter foraging was about survival. People dug through frozen earth for roots, chewed bark, and stripped ivy or brambles to get to anything green underneath. They boiled pine needles and nettles into thin broth. They roasted acorns. They ate moss. In famine years, even this wasn't enough. Chroniclers report people eating grass, straw, leather, and even dirt. In some villages, there were rumors of cannibalism, especially during the Great Famine of 1315, 1317. Parents abandoned children. Some sold them, others starved beside them. Bread wasn't set always bread. When grain ran out, peasants got creative, and not in a good way. They made what were called famine breads. These weren't loaves as we know them. They were made from ground-up tree bark, ferns, moss, bean husks, and old flour, whatever could be turned into a paste. Sometimes dried peas were ground into powder, sometimes lentils. Often the bread was bitter, gray, and hard to digest, and it had consequences. These substitutes often led to digestive illness, poisoning, or internal bleeding. Some people died faster from what they did manage to eat than from hunger itself. Cold makes hunger worse. There's a cruel irony here. The colder it got, the more food your body needed, and the less of it there was. In freezing weather, the body burns calories just to stay alive, even when you're not moving, and peasants weren't sitting still. They were digging trenches, chopping wood, hauling hay, breaking ice, carrying children. Their bodies cried out for fat, heat, and energy. But the colder it got, the harder it was to find food. Fields froze, rivers iced over, even firewood became hard to find, and so starvation and hypothermia often went hand in hand. When animals disappeared, livestock was usually slaughtered in late fall. There wasn't enough fodder to keep many animals alive through winter, so families saved just enough to breed in spring. But in hard winters, even these surviving animals were eaten. People killed their chickens, goats, even dogs. There are records of people boiling ox hides or old leather boots, scraping the salt and chewing whatever gelatinous material was left. It was food in name only. Milk animals were especially valuable, so they were spared longest, but when things got truly dire, even those were consumed, either by the family or stolen in the night. What starvation looked like? It wasn't dramatic. Not at first. Hunger began with fatigue, slowed movement, and shorter tempers. Children grew silent. Men grew withdrawn. Women gave away their portions. Then came the swelling, hunger edema, a sign the body was breaking down muscle. Joints ached, bellies distended, hair fell out, teeth loosened, vision blurred. Eventually the heart gave out. Teeth loosened, vision blurred. Eventually the heart gave out. In some villages, the dead were too many to bury properly. Graves froze, corpses piled up in the churchyards. Rats flourished, wolves crept closer. Famine wasn't just absence, it was decay. The role of the church and nobility. The church sometimes distributed alms during famine. Monasteries opened soup kitchens or gave out bread, especially during Lent or Christmas, but supply rarely met demand. Lords were technically responsible for their tenants' well-being, but in practice, many turned them away. In times of extreme scarcity, hoarding was common, so was violence. Some wealthier towns closed their gates to wandering peasants. Others required proof of land or birth to receive aid, and so beggars flooded the roads, hungry, freezing, and despised. Belief, punishment, and moral panic. Starvation wasn't just a physical crisis, it was a moral and spiritual one. Medieval people saw famine as divine punishment. Maybe the village had sinned. Maybe a witch cursed the crops. Maybe God was testing their faith. Some towns held public penance rituals, dragging crosses through snow or walking barefoot through the streets to beg forgiveness. Others blamed minorities or outsiders, Jews, heretics, or lepers. It was easier to point fingers than accept the randomness of hunger. In some cases, flagellant groups would roam the countryside, whipping themselves in public to atone for the famine. These scenes, mud, blood, frost, chanting, were surreal, but very real. The last bite, the final stage of starvation, was quiet. People didn't die screaming. They curled up under straw, drifted into sleep, and slipped away, sometimes in barns, sometimes beside hearths that had no fire, sometimes huddled together for warmth that never came. And when the thaw finally arrived, survivors would find neighbors half buried in snow, frozen in doorways, cradling children who had stopped breathing days ago. That was winter starvation, not a dramatic fall, but a slow, grinding fade. In the coldest nights of winter, heat was more than a luxury. It was currency. It was security. Sometimes it was the only thing keeping you alive. But here's the thing. When there's not enough warmth to go around, people get creative. They lie. They steal. They build entire systems of survival based not on money, but on proximity to heat. This section is about those systems. The rules everyone knew, but no one spoke out loud. The bargains struck around embers and blankets, and the quiet calculations, who would live and who might not, huddled together, alive together. Most peasants didn't sleep alone. Entire families shared a single bed, or more often, a pile of straw. Parents, children, even animals slept in one room, sometimes under the same blanket, not for affection, for heat. A cow in the room might stink, but it gave off warmth. So did chickens, dogs, even pigs. In fact, pigs were often considered the best indoor animals for winter, short, fat, and radiating body heat like a little furnace. Sleeping together meant you might wake up. Sleeping alone meant you might not. Whose fire was it? Fires were life. But firewood was limited, and not every peasant had their own hearth. So people shared, or fought. A central fire in a communal building might become a gathering point for the poorest. Neighbors might trade favors to warm their hands for a few hours. Widows and orphans often found themselves begging at a neighbor's door, not for food, but for a chance to stand near the flames. Of course, not everyone was generous. There were arguments, grudges, and whispered accusations. She sat too close. He didn't chop enough wood. They took more than their share. These weren't petty squabbles. They were survival-level disputes, because to be denied fire was to be sentenced to cold. Stealing heat. Some took what was instead offered. They crept into barns at night and buried themselves in the hay. They leaned against someone else's wall to soak up the warmth from within. They climbed into abandoned houses or snuck through gaps in thatched roofs. Anything to be closer to fire, or at least out of the wind. In some towns, people were caught stealing embers or hot stones from public fires, tucked into cloth and rushed home to light a hearth. It sounds strange to us, but in a world without central heating, an ember was priceless. Theft, punishment, and mercy. Caught stealing a loaf of bread, you might be beaten or branded, but caught stealing fire, and people hesitated. There were limits to punishment in winter. Even the harshest lords knew that if you executed a man for stealing firewood, his children would die too, and that made for bad morale. So punishment varied. Sometimes it was public shame. Sometimes it was forced labor. Sometimes, especially for women and the elderly, it was overlooked altogether. But others weren't so lucky. There are accounts of peasants being flogged, imprisoned, or expelled from their villages for stealing heat, and exile in winter was almost always a death sentence. The quiet economy of warmth. It wasn't all theft. Much of the warmth in medieval villages came from quiet mutual aid. The family with more firewood might take in the sick widow next door. A childless couple might let neighbor kids sleep by their hearth. In some cases, villages rotated who got the warmest corner of the hall or who received the best furs. It wasn't kindness so much as strategy, because if you let your neighbors die, the village got smaller, and the smaller the village, the less likely you were to survive next winter. This wasn't charity. It was an unspoken system of shared survival. Blankets, clothes, and the skin trade. Wool was gold in winter. If you didn't have enough blankets, you layered everything: cloaks, rags, sacks, even curtains. Peasants often sewed old cloth into patchwork wraps, stuffed them with straw, and tied them to their legs or chests. Clothing itself became a form of warmth sharing. Some families passed a single heavy cloak around the house in shifts. Others slept wrapped in wet animal skins they'd warmed by the fire. Disgusting, yes, but warmer than being bare. And if someone died, their clothes were stripped immediately, not for sentiment, for survival, because a dead man's cloak might save a living child. What children learned early. Children weren't spared the rules. They learned when to stay quiet, when to crowd closer, and when to pretend they weren't freezing. Older siblings shared body heat with the youngest. Babies were wrapped in fur-lined sacks and kept between their parents at night. And they learned not to complain, because complaining didn't bring more wood. Complaining didn't make the fire hotter. And sometimes, complaining got you sent outside to cool off, a punishment that could turn deadly in January. Survival was obedience, and warmth was a reward you had to earn. End of the season, end of the struggle. As spring crept in, things thawed slowly, unevenly. The snow melted, the fires burned lower. People emerged from their houses, pale, thin, and blinking like cave creatures. Some carried frostbite, some limped from the cold, some didn't come out at all, but they sad made it. In a village of survivors, there was no ceremony, no cheering, just the slow return to work, plowing, sowing, hoping the next harvest would be better, because everyone knew the cold would come again, and when it did, warmth would once again become the most valuable thing in the world. Sleep should be simple. Lie down, drift off, wake up. But for medieval peasants, it was anything but. On the coldest nights, sleep was a risk, one of the most dangerous things you could do. The deeper you slept, the less your body moved, and if the temperature dropped just a few degrees while you lay still, you might not wake up at all. So, what did sleep look like in the dead of winter? In a world without insulation or central heat, it wasn't soft, it wasn't peaceful, and it certainly wasn't safe. Let's break it down. First, the setup. What did a bed even look like? If you imagine a peasant bed as something with a mattress, sheets, or even a raised frame, reset your expectations. For the vast majority of peasants, a bed was a patch of straw, maybe hay, maybe dried rushes. If they were lucky, it was on a wooden platform. If not, it was on the dirt floor. And they didn't sleep alone. The entire household often crammed together into this bed: parents, children, infants, and often animals, a sleeping pile, not for comfort, but for heat. The straw was changed rarely. Blankets were limited. Bedding was often infested with lice or fleas, and on wet nights, moldy, but it was still better than sleeping upright on a bench, or worse, on bare earth, sleeping fully dressed. And then some. Here's what's wild. Medieval peasants didn't undress for bed, not in winter. They wore every piece of clothing they owned: tunics, cloaks, underthings, furs, wraps, layered one over the other like living onions. Some even wore shoes to bed if they had them. Clothes were essential for insulation, but they were also reused, rarely washed, and often full of holes, so peasants would wrap additional materials, rags, sacks, straw-stuffed cloth, around their legs, hands, and heads before lying down. They didn't care about looking foolish. They cared about not freezing to death in their sleep. Segmented sleep, a night broken into. Here's something most people today don't know. Sleep used to come in two parts. Medieval records across Europe describe what was called first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after sunset, around 6 or 7 p.m. in winter, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night, naturally, and stay awake for an hour or two before going back to bed until dawn. Why? Two reasons. First, without artificial light, your body naturally slips into this two-phase pattern. But second, and more critically in winter, waking up midway helped keep you alive. That middle of the night wakefulness was when peasants tended the fire, checked on the animals, moved around to restore circulation, or just huddled closer to family. It broke the stillness, it kept the blood flowing, and it may have prevented a lot of people from slipping into fatal hypothermia during a single deep, uninterrupted sleep. Dreams and the cold, strange visions, sleep talkers, and more. Cold changes how you sleep, and it changes how you dream. When your body is fighting off freezing temperatures, sleep becomes fragmented. You slip in and out of shallow rest. You may twitch, shiver, or jerk awake with cramps or numb limbs, and when you do dream, those dreams can get strange. Medieval writings and church records mention wintertime visions. People dreamed of fires, glowing figures, or floating above snow covered fields. Many interpreted these as religious signs or demonic attacks. Some believed night terrors were caused by spirits drawn to cold, vulnerable bodies. Children cried out. Adults muttered prayers in their sleep, and every so often, someone would wake up and find their sleeping partner stiff and pale, never to wake again. Dreams weren't entertainment, they were omens, warnings, or just the brain's desperate way of processing fear, fatigue, and frostbite. The night watch. Who stayed awake and why? In some households, someone stayed half awake on purpose. This night watch wasn't formal, but it was real. A parent might stay up to keep the fire going. An older sibling might take the cold side of the bed first, then rotate with others midway through the night. In rare cases, neighbors took turns checking on each other, especially if someone was elderly, pregnant, or sick. Why? Because if the fire died, or if the roof let in snow, or if someone stopped breathing and no one noticed, there might be a body by morning. Being the one who stayed awake didn't mean safety, but it meant responsibility. And responsibility sometimes made the difference between life and death. Don't fet sleep too long. The morning risk. The most dangerous time wasn't always midnight. It was just before dawn. By then, the fire had burned low. The chill had crept in. Bodies had been still for too long. If someone was going to die from cold exposure in bed, this was usually when it happened. So there were habits, rituals, quiet alarms. Roosters crowed. Dogs stirred. Someone always tried to get up first, poke the fire, open the shutters, move their limbs. That movement created sound, and sound stirred the others. The first person to rise each morning wasn't just starting the day, they were waking the living and confirming who hadn't made it through the night. If your home couldn't keep out the cold, you had two choices: suffer through it or sleep somewhere else. For many medieval peasants, that somewhere else was underground. Sounds odd now, but it made perfect sense then. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature. Beneath the frost line, the earth stays surprisingly mild, even in the heart of winter. Let's look at the ways peasants took shelter beneath their own feet. Dugouts and earth huts, not just for the poor. Across medieval Europe, there were dwellings known as Grubenhäuser, or sunken floor houses, simple homes dug into the ground by 2 to 3 feet, with timber or wattle walls and thatched or turf-covered roofs. Think half underground huts. They weren't always signs of poverty. In colder regions, this was just smart architecture. These homes used the earth as insulation. On freezing nights, temperatures inside could remain survivable even if there was no fire at all. Add in body heat from people and animals, and the space could warm up considerably. It wasn't glamorous. Floors were packed dirt. Airflow was poor, but in terms of pure thermal efficiency, it was better than a wooden cabin with a drafty roof. Cellars and storage pits. From root vegetables to refuge, every village had storage pits, dugouts used to preserve turnips, beets, cabbage, and salted meats. In desperate times, those same pits became sleeping quarters. Some families even reinforced their storage cellars with wooden beams, laid down straw or old sacks, and crawled inside to sleep on the worst nights. This was especially common during snowstorms. If the wind made it impossible to sleep above ground, families bundled together and descended into root cellars with a single lantern or candle to warm their hands. You might be inches from your winter food supply, but if it kept you alive, that was a risk you took. Barns, byres, and sleeping beside beasts. Another underground adjacent tactic: sleeping with livestock. Peasant barns often had sunken stalls, small dugout spaces, where animals were kept slightly below ground level for warmth. In brutal weather, peasants crawled in with them. Cows, goats, pigs, they all generated serious body heat. Sleeping beside a cow in a pit of straw might smell awful, but it could keep a child from freezing. And while it wasn't common year-round, it was widely accepted as a last resort option in deep winter. Some barn floors even had hidden crawl spaces, where children were sent to wait out blizzards or freezing winds. Turf houses and snow-buried homes. In far northern parts of Europe, Scotland, Iceland, Scandinavia, peasants built turf houses, thick-walled dwellings made from stacked sod. In deep winter, the snow itself became an insulating layer. This gave rise to one of the stranger phenomena in peasant life: deliberately letting your house get buried. When snowstorms blanketed the land, some families avoided digging themselves out. Instead, they stayed inside, reinforced the door with more thatch, and sealed themselves in for a day or two. It sounds terrifying, but it actually worked. The snow acted like a thermal blanket, trapping body heat inside. Families took turns stoking the fire, feeding the animals, and melting snow for water. It was cramped, it was smoky, but they survived. The trick was not staying buried too long. Once the smoke had nowhere to go, carbon monoxide could build up. Many medieval peasants knew this the hard way, so they built smoke holes in chimney slits, even when buried under several feet of snow. Snow caves and emergency shelters. In emergencies, especially for shepherds or travelers caught on the road, peasants dug snow caves. A snow cave, if shaped correctly, can hold warmth and protect against wind. You dig sideways into a drift, carve a small chamber, block the entrance with a cloak or sack, and lie inside on top of straw, branches, or even manure. That last part wasn't a joke. A frozen pile of manure, if dried, could act as an insulation layer between your body and the snow. It stank, but it worked. Villagers near the mountains knew how to do this. Children were taught basic snow shelter construction if they lived in alpine areas. You didn't need a perfect igloo, just a place where your breath wouldn't freeze in the air before it reached your nose. Cemeteries, chapels, and sacred heat. And then there were the desperate choices, the places you'd only sleep if you had no other option. Village chapels were sometimes left open at night for prayer. On freezing nights, poor travelers or widows might sleep beside the altar, huddled under cloaks, believing divine protection would keep them warm. In some regions, gravediggers and sextons slept in cemetery sheds or even old crypts where the earth's warmth kept the air just above freezing. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter, and the dead didn't steal your bread or kick you in their sleep. Was it safe? Not always, but it was clever. None of these underground sleeping strategies were perfect. Fires smoked, air got stale, roofs leaked, and in some cases, cave-ins or carbon monoxide poisoning ended lives. But here sits the thing They were smart. Peasants didn't just endure winter, they adapted to it. They used every scrap of knowledge handed down through generations about soil, wind, snow, warmth, rot, and body heat. They didn't always win the battle against the cold, but they knew how to fight it. Even if you had fire, warmth, and shelter, there was still one thing many peasants feared most about winter nights: the dark itself. See? Night wasn't just when you rested, it was when the world changed. In the medieval mind, darkness was full of spirits, ghosts, disease, and demons. And winter darkness, that was the worst kind of all. You didn't just go to sleep. You prepared for it, like you were going into battle. The second sleep, a night broken in two. Let's start with how peasants actually slept. It wasn't like today. What bouties? In much of medieval Europe, sleep came in two halves: the first sleep and the second sleep. After nightfall, peasants would eat dinner, say prayers, and go to bed not long after sunset. They'd sleep for a few hours, maybe from 7 p.m. to midnight, and then wake up. This wasn't insomnia, it was expected. In that quiet space between first and second sleep, people might stoke the fire, check on animals, pray or meditate, tend to quiet household tasks, talk with a spouse, reflect on dreams. It was a liminal time, strange still, and often spiritual. In fact, many believed your dreams between the two sleeps were visions, either sent by saints or warnings from demons. After an hour or two awake, people drifted into their second sleep until dawn. The darkest hours, between midnight and 3 a.m., were when people were most vulnerable, physically and spiritually. That's when they guarded their souls as much as their bodies. Dreams, nightmares, and winter phantoms. Sleeping in winter meant more than keeping warm. It meant keeping things out. You'd block the cold, yes, but also the dead, spirits, demons, the old woman, in the snow. In Northern Europe, the perchta or holda was said to wander cold nights, punishing those who didn't finish their spinning or broke household taboos. In the Alps, Krampus wasn't just a Christmas figure, he was part of the winter dreamscape. Many peasants believed winter nightmares weren't just bad dreams, they were real. A crushing weight on your chest, that was a mare. A demon sitting on you. Strange voices in the snow. Wights luring the weak to die in the frost. Waking frozen and breathless, a sign that your soul had wandered and nearly failed to return. To ward these off, people placed charms under pillows, twigs of rowan or yew, small crosses or relics, bits of iron to repel fairies and spirits. Children were told not to speak their dreams aloud in winter, or it might call the dream back the next night. Sleep was survival, but it was also a threshold. The dark might let you wake up, or it might not. Blessings, bed prayers, and sacred fire. Before sleep, even the least devout peasants usually said some kind of prayer. It wasn't just piety, it was insurance. Common phrases included, "Deliver us from frost, fire, and thieves. Guard our bed from harm and dream. If I should die before I wake, take my soul and warm it." In many households, especially in the British Isles, hearth rituals were common. Before the last embers were covered at night, someone might trace a protective circle of ash around the fire, or say a blessing over the coals. May this fire burn in peace, and no ill wind pass our door. Families often left bread or milk out overnight, either for spirits or to avoid the bad luck of going to bed with an empty table. Some placed salt at windows and thresholds, a barrier against evil. Others hung bundles of dried herbs over sleeping children, lavender for calm, sage for protection. Superstition? Sure. But remember, this was a world without thermometers, antibiotics, or insulation. Belief filled in the gaps science hadn't reached yet. And when the snow fell harder than ever, belief was sometimes all they had. Silence was sacred. Why nights were kept quiet. Another part of surviving winter sleep was learning to live with silence. In warm seasons, night buzzed with life, frogs, insects, owls, laughter from nearby homes. But in deep winter, it was dead silent, so silent it could frighten you. This silence wasn't just absence, it was presence. The presence of cold, of stillness, of the void that waited just beyond the firelight. Peasants respected that silence. You didn't shout after sunset unless there was danger. You didn't whistle either. Whistling at night was thought to summon spirits or storms. The quiet was seen as sacred, or at least powerful. Breaking it felt wrong. In that silence, you slept carefully, breathing slow, listening for creaks or footsteps that weren't yours. And if you made it to morning, you thanked the saints, or luck, or your grandmother's charms, and did it again the next night. To sleep was to risk, and to trust. Let's not romanticize it. Peasants' sleep in the medieval world could be cold, smoky, uncomfortable, and terrifying, but it was also a space of intense human resilience. People didn't just collapse into slumber. They prepared. They fought for rest, like they fought for food or firewood. They wrapped themselves in rituals, community wisdom, and whispered prayers passed down for centuries. And through all of it, the cold, the dark, the strange dreams, they endured. Sleep was their most vulnerable state, but also one of their most courageous acts. Every night, they chose to trust that morning would come. Here's the thing about winter in medieval Europe. It wasn't just cold. It was empty. Empty fields, empty pantries, empty bellies. This was the hunger season, the time between the end of autumn's last harvest and the beginning of spring's first growth. And for medieval peasants, it was the most dangerous time of all. Not because of war, not because of wolves, because of hunger. The calendar was a clock counting down to nothing. The medieval farming year was brutally predictable. You harvested in late summer and early autumn. You stored, salted, dried, smoked, and hoped. And then you waited. October. Larders were full. Beer was fresh. Bread was thick. December. Still enough. Just barely. A good month, if you planned well. February and March. The larder was nearly bare. The beer had gone sour. The grain bins were dusty. You prayed the onions would hold. The term for this wasn't poetic. It was the famine months. Even in good years, most peasants ate less during Lent, not for religious discipline, but because there was almost nothing left to eat. And remember, this wasn't about choice. You couldn't import food from Spain or Poland. You couldn't buy canned goods or frozen vegetables. If your harvest had been poor, or if the autumn had been wet, or rats got into your storage, you simply ran out. What did they eat when they ran out of food? Let Seps be blunt. In late winter, peasants ate things that no modern grocery store would dare carry. Here is a list of some of the more common last resort options. Bran cakes, made from the outer husks of grain, the stuff normally fed to pigs, boiled weeds and roots, dandelions, nettles, dock, and even the leaves of trees. Tree bark, particularly birch or elm, scraped, dried, ground into a powder and mixed with flour, moss, or lichen, scraped from rocks, boiled and mixed with scraps of porridge. Spoiled food, moldy bread was often trimmed and recooked. Rotting vegetables were boiled into oblivion and eaten with vinegar. Desperate times didn't always mean dignified meals. In famine conditions, even animal feed became human food. Oat chaff, bean husks, barley sweepings. People made bread out of acorns, soaked to remove the bitter tannins. Others ate boiled straw, and when those failed, they turned to leather, if they could get it. Boots, belts, old harnesses, anything that could be softened, chewed, and swallowed. The thin months shaped their bodies and beliefs. This annual starvation cycle left marks. Literally, chronic malnutrition, especially in children, led to stunted growth, bowed legs, and dental deformities. Rickets was common. So was scurvy. The medieval body was a seasonal thing. It expanded after harvest and shrank in winter. And yet, despite all of this, hunger was seen as natural, even righteous. Religious teachings praised fasting. Saints were said to survive on nothing but snow or a single crust of bread for months. The Virgin Mary was often depicted feeding the poor from a bottomless bowl, a fantasy no one mistook for reality, but everyone wished were true. Peasants didn't just fear hunger, they expected it, planned for it, passed it down through stories, warnings, and grim little nursery rhymes, like this one from 15th century France. When the snow is deep and bread is thin, the devil dances on empty skin. Why didn't they just hunt or fish? This is a common question. It makes sense. Forests were everywhere, rivers too. So why not just go get food? The answer is laws. Hunting rights were fiercely protected by lords and kings. In many regions, it was illegal for a peasant to hunt deer, boar, rabbits, or even birds. Forests were owned, and poaching could mean whipping, mutilation, or even death. Fishing had similar restrictions. Many streams were claimed by monasteries or manors, and fishing rights were sold, inherited, or hoarded. Sure, some peasants broke the rules, but the risks were real. Getting caught with a deer carcass could be worse than starving quietly. So they survived within boundaries, ones drawn not by nature, but by feudal power, the quiet horror of empty days. One of the most chilling things about the hunger season wasn't how dramatic it was how slow. There were no explosions, no raids, no monsters, just less. A little less bread each week, a little less energy each morning, a little more mold on the cheese, a little more desperation in your mother's voice when you asked for seconds. People didn't scream in hunger, they just faded. They slept more, moved less, spoke in whispers, saved crumbs, boiled bones, over and over. By late March, hope didn't come from the pantry. It came from the first green shoots outside the cottage door. And sometimes, not even then. Here's what most people miss about medieval peasant food. It wasn't just about what they ate. It was about how they made it last. Because surviving a medieval winter wasn't only about having food. It was about stretching it for as long as humanly possible. This section is about the tricks, the cheats, the 1,000 little ways poor people turned almost nothing into just enough. Let's step into their kitchens, not the castles, but the smoky, cold, soot-covered cottages, where real people cooked with firewood and desperation. Trick no one. Bulk it up with filler. Peasants learned early. Real flour was precious. It was expensive to grow, to mill, and to store, so when they made bread, they didn't use 100% wheat unless they were incredibly lucky or rich. Instead, they cut it with anything remotely edible: beans or peas dried and ground into powder, barley, husks, crushed chestnuts, ground up acorns, soaked first to remove the bitterness, chalk or clay, seriously when desperate. This filler bread was heavy, coarse, and didn't rise well, but it filled the belly, and that was the goal. Soup was another example. You didn't need much meat to make a stew, just a bone, maybe a few fatty scraps. Throw in turnips, stale bread, cabbage leaves, and onions if you had them. Boil for hours. Season with salt, if you were lucky enough to afford it. The trick was volume. They weren't aiming for rich or hearty. They were aiming for plenty, even if it was mostly water and hope. Trick no. 2, steal flavor without ingredients. When real flavoring ingredients were too expensive, peasants got inventive. Ashes from sweet wood were stirred into porridge for a smoky, faintly sweet taste. Vinegar added bite to spoiled vegetables or thin stews. Wild herbs like sorrel, nettle, and mugwort were tossed into everything, mostly for nutrition, but also for tang or bitterness. Charred onions or garlic skins gave an illusion of roast flavor in soups with no meat. Even old bread crusts, soaked in water and vinegar, could become the base for a cold soup. Add oil if you had it rare, or mustard seeds, unlikely, and you had something like a peasant's gazpacho. This was instead cuisine. This was survival seasoning. Trick no. 3, master the boil. Here's one thing every medieval peasant kitchen could do: boil things. Boiling used less fuel than baking, took fewer ingredients, and worked with nearly anything. A bone boiled long enough would release fat and flavor. Stale bread became pottage. Spoiled vegetables became soup, especially if you boiled them into oblivion and strained out the worst bits. Many families had only one pot, and it stayed on the fire most of the day. That pot was everything: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and hot water in between. They'd scrape it out, clean it with hot water or ashes, and then reuse it the next day. Sometimes, for weeks, the pot never left the hearth. Trick no. 4, ferment it before it rots. Fermentation was a peasantist's best friend, not for fine wine or fancy cheese, but for survival. Sour porridge was made from barley or oats, left to soak and sour over days. It was filling, tangy, and often eaten cold. Pickled vegetables were sometimes buried in salt or brine jars. Sour milk, clabbered milk, was used instead of fresh. Peasants didn't waste curdled milk. They turned it into a soft cheese or drank it anyway. Fermenting didn't just make things last. It added nutrients and made tough fibers more digestible. It also meant fewer stomach infections. Oddly enough, a sour pot of barley gruel might have been safer than a fresh bucket of river water. Trick no. 5, make food look bigger than it was. When food ran short, illusion helped. One common trick was to make flatbread or porridge in larger dishes and spread it thin, so it looked like more. Another trick was to serve watery food in smaller bowls, so everyone finished fast, and felt like they'd had their share. Families also trained kids early: eat slowly, chew longer, drink water first, and praise the cook, no matter how grim the food. This wasn't just etiquette, it was a survival tactic. You kept morale up, avoided fights over portions, and kept hope alive. Trick no. 6. Eat in rituals. One of the best ways peasants made it through hunger was structure. Meals were often eaten at the same times, morning and evening, with a small snack or beer in between if possible. Eating on a schedule helped stretch food and build routine into the chaos of winter. Blessings were said, sometimes long ones, not just for God, but to buy time. Let the stew cool. Let the smell settle in. Let your stomach feel like something important was happening. They didn't just eat food, they made an event out of it, because sometimes ritual was the only thing between a family and despair. Trick no. 7. Pretend you were full. This one's hard to write about, but important to say. There were times when food wasn't enough, and everyone knew it. In many peasant families, parents ate less so children could eat more. Fathers would pretend to be full. Mothers would accidentally burn their own portion. Older siblings would wait for seconds that never came. They told each other it was fine, that they weren't hungry, that they had eaten already. That kind of love, the kind that gives up the last crust of bread, is what actually kept people alive, not just in body, but in spirit. We've talked about the tricks, the ways peasants stretched food and outsmarted hunger, but sometimes none of it worked. Sometimes the winter came too early, or the harvest failed, or the Lord took too much, or the rats took everything before the sacks even made it into storage. This section isn't about clever survival. It's about what happened when there was nothing left to survive on. It's grim, but it's the truth, and it's part of the full picture of peasant life. When the granary was empty, let's start with a fact. Most medieval peasants didn't store grain in big locked buildings. That was for nobles and abbeys. Peasants stored food in tiny wooden bins, clay jars, or underground pits. Sometimes they had just enough to get through a few months of winter if nothing went wrong. But things always went wrong. A damp season ruined stored grain with mold. A rat infestation meant spoiled flour or chewed sacks. A neighbor's fire could spread and take your shed, your thatch, your stores. And if the weather turned, say a late frost hit the barley in May, that wasn't just bad news. That was a death sentence 6 months from now. The scariest thing about food shortages was that everyone saw them coming and no one could stop them. Selling tools, selling dignity. When the food ran out, peasants started selling what little they had. A wooden rake, a piglet, a cooking pot, a bit of wool, a comb or belt buckle, or pair of boots. These weren't luxuries, these were tools of survival. Selling them meant making it through one more week, but it also meant next year would be harder because now you had to work without them. Some sold the rights to their own labor, agreeing to work a noble's land for free, just for food. Others pawned future harvests, borrowed money they couldn't repay, promised their children into servitude. In the worst years, whole families walked away from their land looking for food elsewhere. The village called them sturdy beggars, able-bodied, but desperate. What hunger really looked like. Hunger wasn't a single moment. It was a season, and it got inside you. First came the constant emptiness, gnawing, not just in your stomach, But in your brain, people became forgetful, angry, sluggish. Kids cried less, not more, because they didn't have the energy. They stopped playing, stopped growing. Then came the swelling. Feet, ankles, bellies, a sign of starvation. Old people went first, quietly, often in their sleep. Then infants, then the sick. Some villages buried so many, they ran out of wood for coffins. The rule of 3 years. Here's something from medieval records that doesn't get talked about much. Famines often didn't kill in year one. People scraped by the first year. They borrowed, they begged, they diluted their bread and watered down their stew. But by year two, the debt had caught up, the tools were gone. The animals had been eaten, the seed grain, meant for planting, had been cooked and served. By year three, people weren't dying from this year's hunger. They were dying because they had nothing left to recover with. It's called the rule of 3 years in famine studies, because that's often how long it took a disaster to kill a village. What people ate when nothing was left. These aren't set in legends. These are recorded. When all else failed, peasants ate bark peeled from trees and boiled to soften, grass mixed into flour to stretch it further, leather from shoes, belts, harnesses, soaked and stewed, dead animals found in the woods, long past safe, clay or dirt, in rare cases, not for nutrition, just for the illusion of fullness. And in the worst recorded famines, there were whispers of something darker. Human remains, grave robbing, even cannibalism. It's not myth. There are church records from France, Germany, and Eastern Europe noting trials, arrests, or quiet burials tied to such things. But that was sit ordinary. That was collapse, the return of hope. Here's the thing about peasants. They didn't expect plenty, but they always expected the next harvest. Spring was agony. You were at your weakest right when the work was hardest. But spring meant green shoots. It meant eggs again. It meant milk. Maybe. It meant hope. If the barley came in, if the rains were kind, if the pests stayed away, then you could rebuild, slowly, one meal at a time. Some didn't make it, but the ones who did, they didn't forget. Every crust of bread after a famine tasted like salvation. Every boiled turnip felt like gold, because they knew what it meant to survive on nothing. Forget the romantic idea of a medieval peasant sitting by a roaring fire in a cozy cottage. That image, that's a luxury. Most peasants weren't relaxing by the fire. They were fighting to survive with it. Because fire wasn't just about warmth. It was your stove, your light, your protection, your sanitation system, and your only way to push back against a deadly winter. So let's go inside a typical medieval peasant home and see what the hearth actually looked like, how it worked, and how it kept people alive when temperatures dropped below freezing. The hearth was the center of everything. The first thing to understand is that the word hearth didn't mean a fireplace with a chimney. That came later. Most peasant homes, especially before the 13th century, had a simple open fire in the middle of the floor, with the smoke rising up and escaping through a hole in the roof or just drifting out through the thatch. There was no chimney, no hood, just smoke everywhere. That smoke blackened the beams. It stung your eyes. It made your clothes smell, but it also killed insects, preserved meat, dried herbs, and insulated the thatch against decay. In short, it was horrible and completely necessary. And if you were rich, you had a separate hearth and a chimney. But if you were a peasant, your whole world rotated around that sooty pile of glowing wood in the center of the room. Getting the fire started wasn't stat easy. If you think lighting a fire with wet kindling in a snowstorm is hard today, try doing it in the Middle Ages with no matches, no lighter, and often no dry wood. Here's stats what peasants had to work with: flint and steel, if they were lucky, but fire strikers made from iron tools, tinder boxes filled with dried moss, bark, or even linen scraps charred black, and the real treasure, a glowing coal carried from a neighbor's hearth if yours went out. Keeping fire alive was a full-time job. If the fire died in the night, you didn't just get cold, you lost your ability to cook, to heat water, to bake, to survive. Which is why many peasants never let their fire die. Even at night, they'd bank the coals, burying them in ash so they smoldered instead of burned, ready to be revived in the morning. It was a skill, one you learned young, and if you messed it up, you froze. Fire was the only real heating system. Medieval peasant houses weren't designed for comfort. They were built to trap warmth as best they could, with whatever materials were cheap and nearby. Stone, if you were lucky. But many peasants had wattle and daub walls, woven sticks smeared with mud, and thatched roofs. No insulation, no glass windows, just wooden shutters and layers of fabric nailed across the frame to keep out drafts. So the fire had to do everything. It heated the room, it dried your clothes, it warmed your water, it toasted your food, it thawed your fingers, and most of all, it created a heat zone right around it. The adults sat closest, doing chores or mending tools. The children lay nearby on straw or wool blankets. The sick or elderly stayed as close as possible, sometimes nearly in the embers, but beyond a few feet, it was just cold. The smoke had a purpose too. Now this might sound strange, but the smoke that filled the room actually helped. Why? Because it killed bacteria and bugs. The smoke dried out the air, preserved hanging meats, and repelled lice and fleas. It helped keep thatched roofs from rotting. It even acted as a kind of crude disinfectant, especially when certain herbs were burned, like juniper, sage, or thyme. Some historians think this might have even helped slow down certain diseases inside cramped cottages, just a little. So yes, the smoke made you cough, but it was also part of what kept the household alive. You couldn't open the windows to let it out, because then you'd freeze. You just lived in it, slept in it, raised babies in it. There's a reason medieval artwork shows peasants with red-rimmed eyes and sooty cheeks. It wasn't stylization, it was reality. If you imagine a medieval peasant kitchen, you probably think of a rustic little setup with pots hanging over a fire and bread baking in an oven tucked into the wall. Reality, much rougher. There was no kitchen. The hearth was the kitchen, the stove, the prep space, the dishwater heater, and the light source. Everything revolved around it. And during the cold months, cooking became more than just daily maintenance. It was about survival. So let's step into the life of a peasant cook in the dead of winter and see what really simmered over that fire. Bread was life, but you might not bake it yourself. First thing to know, bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, even for peasants, but that doesn't mean they baked it at home every day. In fact, many peasants, especially those working on manorial estates, were required to use the Lord's oven and pay for it. That meant walking to the manor, handing over your dough, and paying in kind or coin to get your loaves baked. So at home, what did they actually do? Flat breads, made on hot stones or iron griddles, porridges from grains like barley or oats, pottage, a thick stew made from beans, peas, cabbage, leeks, and whatever else was lying around. These were one-pot meals, cooked low and slow over embers all day, easy to stir, easy to stretch, and warming from the inside out. No spices, no salt unless you were lucky, and very little meat. But when it's freezing, even a watery bowl of lentils tastes like gold. What did they eat in the depths of winter? Winter limited everything. The gardens were dead. The fields were bare, so peasants relied on what they had: root vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots, stored in cellars or buried in straw, dried legumes, peas, lentils, and beans soaked and stewed, preserved meats, rarely bits of salted pork or smoked fish, hard cheese, and day-old bread. If you had livestock or good harvests, everything was stretched. Nothing was wasted. The bones went into the pot. The leftover pottage was reheated again and again, sometimes for days. Even gruel, a thin broth of water and oats, could be a meal if you were desperate. And through it all, the fire was your only way to make any of it edible. No fire, no food, herbs, ash, and imagination. Seasoning was minimal in winter. You didn't have fresh herbs. You didn't have salt mines nearby. You didn't have access to spices unless you lived near a trade hub or were wealthy. But peasants got creative. Ash from the fire was sometimes used in food prep, especially in water to help remove holes from grains or preserve beans. Dried herbs from the summer, like thyme, sage, or mint, could add a hint of flavor if you remembered to gather and hang them months before. Occasionally, sour whey, vinegar, or even fermented leftovers were mixed into stews to give a little bite. And every family had their own tweaks, certain combinations of beans, cabbage, and herbs that passed down generations, not because they were gourmet, but because they worked, and they filled you up on long, frigid nights. The hearth was the refrigerator, too. Here's something we don't think about. There was no fridge, no cold cellar, unless you dug one, and not even sealed containers. So winter food storage was a gamble, but the hearth helped. Meat hung near the smoke to dry and preserve. Hot ash kept clay pots warm and food from freezing. Glowing coals could slow cook grains and kill bacteria in milk or broth. It wasn't foolproof. People still got sick, but a carefully tended fire could keep your milk from curdling too fast, or your meal from freezing into a brick. The goal wasn't freshness. The goal was barely edible, but not deadly. And in that sense, the fire was your best friend and your only defense. Cooking wasn't set just about eating. It was about staying warm. This part matters. Cooking all day kept you warm. The process of keeping the pot going meant constant work, stoking coals, chopping fuel, stirring, checking the heat, boiling water. It forced people to move, to stay active, to linger by the hearth. And even when the food was simple and repetitive, the act of making it provided structure to the day. In a dark winter, with snow falling and wind howling outside, The fire wasn't just about calories, it was about ritual, movement, and sanity. Let's be honest, no matter how good your fire was during the day, nights were brutal. Medieval houses weren't insulated, doors didn't seal, wind whistled through cracks in the timber, and if it snowed, it might blow into your home. There was no electric blanket, no radiator, no thermostat, and yet, somehow, peasants made it through those nights without freezing to death. The secret? It wasn't just the fire, it was how they used ashes, coals, bedding, and each other. Let's walk through how they turned freezing nights into survivable ones. Sleeping near the fire, but not too close. Most peasants didn't sleep in the fire's glow. The hearth was central, yes, but it was also dangerous. Fires weren't fenced in. There was no grate or chimney, just coals smoldering in the center of the floor or in a shallow hearth pit. A poorly placed blanket or shift in sleep posture could send a person rolling into embers. So here Hepsis what people did. Slept in a circle around the fire, not next to it. Used low wooden beds or straw mats to keep off the cold floor. Kept coals smoldering slowly overnight, using ash to insulate them. That last part was key. The ember trick, a medieval slow burn hack. Peasants mastered the ember trick, banking the fire. This meant raking hot coals into a tight pile and covering them with a thick layer of ash. The ash acted like insulation, trapping the heat without smothering the embers entirely. Result: a fire that could last 8-12 hours without more fuel. In the morning, they'd rake off the ash, find the still glowing coals, and blow them back into flame. No need to strike sparks from cold flint again. If that sounds basic, imagine the alternative: getting up at 3 a.m. to build a new fire from scratch in pitch black, cold with numb fingers. Ash banking was a lifesaver. Ash beds and hot bricks. Ash had another clever use: warming bedding. People would heat bricks or stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth or straw, and tuck them under their blankets or into straw mattresses. Some even laid beds of warm ash under bedding layers. Dry ash, not smoldering. It held warmth and provided insulation from the frozen ground. Think of it like a poor man's heated mattress pad. It didn't make things cozy by modern standards. But if your toes weren't black with frostbite in the morning, it was a success. Sleeping in groups. Body heat was currency. The most powerful heat source was encysted fire. It was other people. Families often slept in the same bed, especially in winter. Children were crammed between parents, not just for comfort, but to survive. Sometimes livestock, and especially small animals like dogs, goats, or chickens, were brought indoors to sleep in the same room, not just because it was easier to protect them, but because they generated heat. Yes, that means you might have slept in a straw bed with your spouse, your kids, the dog, and a hen. Not ideal, but the alternative was hypothermia, and no one in a freezing hut was picky about personal space. Clothing was not optional at night. Peasants slept fully clothed in winter. Every layer stayed on. Wool tunics, sometimes 2 or 3, cloaks, shawls, and head coverings, thick woolen socks if you had them, or rags wrapped around feet. Sleeping naked wasn't a thing. Even shoes might stay on in the coldest weeks. And in regions with especially harsh winters, people sometimes wrapped themselves in animal skins, fur inwards, for warmth. It wasn't set glamorous, but it worked. The night watch. someone always awake. In some households, especially larger ones, or community dwellings, someone stayed up to tend the fire, not just to keep it going, but to watch for sparks or accidents. Medieval homes burned down easily. Thatched roofs, dry timber, cloth everywhere. One overturned pot of embers, and the whole structure was gone. Their job wasn't glamorous, but without them, everyone could freeze, or worse. Waking up was a ritual. In the morning, you snowed, brush off the ash bank, rekindle the fire from the saved coals. There was no sleeping in, no snooze button, just the cold and the relief of firelight returning to the room. And day after day, through the bleakest weeks, this pattern repeated. Let's be blunt. Sleeping as a medieval peasant sucked. There were no pillows as we know them, no cotton sheets, no memory foam, no mattresses. Period. Not for the poor. And yet, after back-breaking workdays, peasants still manage to rest mostly. The question is how. We romanticize the past, but the reality of peasant bedding was this: lumpy, itchy, crawling with bugs, and often shared with others. In this section, we'll break down what a bed actually looked like for the average medieval peasant, and why just lying down was sometimes its own kind of endurance. The bed was instead a bed. Let's start with expectations. When we say bed, we picture a wooden frame, a mattress, a pillow, maybe even a cozy duvet. A medieval peasant's version was far more humble. At best, they might sleep on a low wooden platform, maybe a pallet if they were lucky. More often, a pile of straw, reeds, or rushes, covered by a rough woolen blanket, a fur if they had one, or just their own clothes. If they had any kind of mattress, it was called a paillasse, essentially a cloth sack stuffed with straw or hay. Over time, the straw compacted and rotted, attracting insects, mice, and mold. These sacks needed to be restuffed every few weeks, which most people didn't always bother doing, so they sagged, crunched, and often smelled horrible. Straw mattresses, cheap and temporary. Why straw? Because it was cheap, abundant, easy to stuff into sacks, and warm, at least for a little while. Straw beds were often placed directly on the dirt floor or onto woven mats to keep them slightly elevated. But over time, moisture and body heat broke them down fast. They got musty, dusty, and itchy. Rushes or reeds were sometimes used instead of straw, especially in wetter areas, because they held up a little longer and were less dusty. But here's the catch. None of these materials were clean. They carried mites, lice, fleas, and other lovely surprises. Blankets were rare and not soft, even in cold climates. Most peasants didn't own more than one blanket. Blankets were usually made from coarse, heavy wool. Not the kind of wool you'd find in a modern sweater. This stuff was scratchy, unprocessed, and barely dyed. You used it until it was threadbare, then patched it, then repurposed it into something else. Peasants often slept in their clothes, using their blanket more like an outer layer. It was not uncommon to share one blanket between 2 or 3 people. If you were really lucky, you might have an old fur or animal skin. Sheep, goat, rabbit, anything you could tan and drape over yourself was fair game. The pillow problem. Peasants didn't have pillows, at least not as we'd think of them. Sometimes they rolled up a piece of cloth, a folded cloak, or even a bundle of straw tied in a rag. Some people just used their arm or shoulder. Others lay completely flat. The idea of a soft, elevated pillow that was for nobility, for the average peasant, head support was whatever you could improvise. What about curtains or privacy? Forget it. Most medieval homes were one-room huts, sometimes divided by a thin wooden partition or hanging fabric if the family had anything extra, but privacy was rare. Beds were shared by spouses, children, siblings, sometimes extended family members, or even neighbors during hard winters. If there was a bed frame, it might be a shared sleeping platform made of planks. In the poorest homes, people slept directly on the dirt floor, sometimes next to animals. Yes, actual animals. A warm goat or chicken might be the only heating system you had. Lice, fleas, and everything that crawled. Now comes the itchy part. Straw, old wool, dirty skin, unwashed clothes. All perfect breeding grounds for lice and fleas. These weren't occasional pests, they were constant companions. Most peasants had no idea how lice spread, let alone how to get rid of them. Combings helped, but there were no real baths, no shampoos, and no pest control. So you'd lay down, exhausted, and itch all night. Some people slept with caps pulled tight around their heads to try to trap lice. Others simply accepted the scratching as part of sleep. And yet, people survived. They adapted. They managed to function. We tend to think of sleep as simple: get tired, go to bed, wake up 8 hours later. But in the medieval world, especially for peasants, sleep was anything but straightforward. It wasn't just about rest, it was about survival, routine, superstition, and sometimes sheer boredom. In this section, we'll walk through what a peasant's night actually looked like, what they did before bed, how they slept, what interrupted it, and what weird habits evolved out of necessity. Bedtime was instead a time. It was a process. There were no clocks, no alarms, no time schedules carved into stone. People followed natural rhythms: the setting sun, the hunger in their bellies, the chill in the air. For most peasants, the day's work ended just after sunset. Light came from tallow candles, rushlights, or the fading fire in the hearth. If you had anything to eat, you ate it. If you had family, you gathered close. Bedtime wasn't announced. It was simply when people started falling asleep wherever they were. Sometimes that was in the straw heap. Sometimes it was sitting by the fire. Sometimes it was mid-sentence while someone mumbled through a prayer. But first, there was chore after chore. Before sleeping, most peasants had a list of small but essential tasks. Tend the fire. If you let it die, you might freeze. Check on animals, especially if they were kept inside the home. Brush lice or fleas off bedding with combs or fingers. Move or flip the straw to disperse damp spots. Use the chamber pot, or go out into the freezing dark. These weren't optional. Neglecting them could mean sickness, bug infestations, or cold injuries. Children were often the ones tasked with relighting lamps, gathering firewood, or shaking out the bedding. It wasn't about comfort, it was survival maintenance. Segmented sleep. Yes, it was real. Here's something strange to modern ears. Most medieval people didn't sleep in one uninterrupted block. Instead, they had first sleep and second sleep. Historical sources, from monks' journals to legal testimony, mention it regularly. Here sips how it worked. After sundown, people would fall asleep for a few hours. This was first sleep. Around midnight, or slightly after, they would wake up naturally. They stayed awake for 1-2 hours, then drifted back into second sleep until dawn. During that midnight break, peasants might tend the fire again, pray or recite psalms. Have sex this time was often called the best time to conceive. Gossip quietly. Even do small tasks like weaving or mending. This kind of biphasic sleep might sound odd today, but it was completely normal then. And it kind of makes sense. Without artificial light, your body naturally adapts to longer nights by breaking sleep into chunks. Superstitions and sleep protection. The night was not considered safe. Darkness was home to devils, witches, demons, and restless spirits. Peasants, even devout ones, often hedged their bets with a mix of religion and folk magic. Common protective rituals included hanging a cross or religious icon above the bed, placing iron tools like scissors or knives near the sleeping area to ward off evil, muttering protective prayers before sleep, sleeping with a charm or amulet, often tied to the wrist or hung around the neck. People also believed dreams carried messages, warnings from the dead, omens from God, or tricks from spirits. If you dreamed about water, childbirth, snakes, or falling, it meant something and you'd probably discuss it in the morning. Snoring, shuffling, and sleeping in groups. Peasants rarely slept alone. Beds were shared between married couples, parents and children, siblings, grandparents, hired laborers, even travelers. If the family offered lodging, that meant noise, jostling, smells, and awkward moments were constant. Someone might snore, someone else might kick, someone might talk in their sleep, someone might crawl over you to get to the chamber pot, and still you had to sleep because dawn meant another 12-14 hours of back-breaking work. Night interruptions, cold, noise, and nature. You could be woken up by cold winds sneaking in through the walls, howling dogs outside, thieves, wolves, or wandering animals, leaking thatch, dripping rainwater onto your blanket, your own bladder. Most peasants slept lightly, by necessity. The idea of sleeping through the night, like a log, that was dangerous. You needed to hear the baby cry, or the pig escape, or the fire hiss into ash. And if you were old, injured, or sick, sleep became even harder. A bad straw bed could turn discomfort into chronic pain. There were no remedies, just a daily grind of restless sleep, cold limbs, and the hope you'd get through winter without your joints locking up. Let's zoom out. We've talked about what peasants slept on and how their nights were structured, but here's the thing. Sleep wasn't just a solo act. It was communal. It was social. It was shaped by family, hardship, and survival instincts that turned a straw heap into a shared refuge from the cold and dark. This final section dives into how entire families navigated winter nights together and how community, poverty, and faith intertwined inside the flickering glow of a peasant's nighttime world. One room, many bodies. Most peasants lived in single-room homes. Sometimes those rooms had no ceiling, just beams. Sometimes they had a tiny loft where children or grain were stored. But for the most part, everything happened in the same space. Cooking, eating, sleeping, working. That meant when the cold hit, every living body became part of your heating strategy. Parents slept beside children. Grandparents curled up near the fire, Animals, chickens, goats, even pigs were brought indoors. Blankets, cloaks, and wool sacks were shared. Straw was fluffed up and rotated between spots for whoever needed more insulation. No one had privacy, but that wasn't the goal. Warmth was. Sleeping with livestock. This wasn't a myth. Livestock were often brought inside for the night, especially in the coldest months. Why? To keep them from freezing to death. To prevent theft, because animals radiated warmth. A cow or sheep was basically a four-legged furnace. It wasn't unusual for a peasant child to fall asleep beside one, wrapped in a shared blanket or straw bedding. There were risks, of course: lice, fleas, dung, disease, but peasants had already made peace with most of those. Survival came first. Songs, stories, and night talk. Peasant nights weren't silent. In those quiet, in-between hours, after supper, before first sleep, or during the wakeful pause, people talked, or they sang, or they told stories. Not fairy tales exactly, but Bible stories passed down orally, legends of saints or miracles, family histories, tales of local ghosts, witches or devils, riddles, folk rhymes, and proverbs. This wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural glue. In the darkness, with no books, no light, no outside world to distract you, these stories became reality. They explained the world. They comforted children. They gave people something to pass down. Sometimes, storytelling lasted right until sleep took over, mid-conversation, mid-prayer, mid-song. Church bells, saints, and sleep guilt. Religion shaped every part of peasant life, including the way they thought about sleep. Sleep was sometimes seen as spiritually risky. If you died in your sleep without confessing your sins, you might not reach heaven. So many peasants recited protective prayers before sleeping, kept small crosses or saint medallions near the bed, feared dreams as possible temptations or signs from the devil, tried to sleep in a state of moral cleanliness. Monasteries rang bells through the night, marking canonical hours. Even if peasants weren't expected to rise and pray like monks, the sound of the bells reminded them God is watching, always, even while you sleep. Some would wake in the middle of the night, recite a psalm, then go back to bed just to show piety. Nights of hunger, fear, and pain. Let's not sugarcoat it. Winter nights were brutal. Not every peasant household had enough blankets or cloaks. They're sued. Some nights were spent lying awake, hungry, stomachs groaning, fingers numb. If your only shoes were wet from work, they might freeze stiff overnight. If your thatch roof leaked, the straw bed underneath it could rot. If you were sick, feverish, coughing, wheezing, there was no medicine, no privacy, no warmth beyond your own breath. It wasn't uncommon for old people to go to sleep and never wake up, or for children to catch cold and spiral into infection. Death didn't knock on the door. It slipped in quietly, sometimes in the middle of the night, while no one noticed until morning. And yet, people adapted. Even in all that hardship, people found ways to cope, to bond, to make life bearable. The shared bed wasn't just about warmth. It was about love, routine, laughter, and often intimacy, despite the lice, the smell, the squeaking straw. Families developed rhythms. Who slept near the wall, who got the warm middle spot, who rolled over first, who whispered the last joke of the night, who got up to check the fire when it hissed. Sleep was an escape. It was just another part of daily survival. But in it, people shared dreams. They healed. They planned for the next day. They endured. And somehow, through lice and straw, hunger and cold, they made it to spring. Let's get straight to the point. What did medieval peasants do when they had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and it was bitterly cold, pitch dark, and the nearest latrine was across a frozen yard? Here's the short answer: they got creative. The long answer? Well, it's messier, colder, and more revealing than you might think. No indoor plumbing, no privy comfort. First, imagine this. It's midnight. You've been asleep for a few hours. The fire has burned low. Outside, frost has sealed the ground. Inside, the air is thick with the breath of sleeping bodies, the smell of straw, wool, and smoke. Suddenly, you need to pee, or worse. Now remember, there's no bathroom, not inside, not nearby. If you're lucky, your household has a basic latrine, a pit dug out back, surrounded by wood planks or wicker fencing. If not, you're either squatting somewhere in the barn or heading for the woods. But at night, in winter, that step's dangerous. You could slip on ice. Wolves or stray dogs might be lurking. You risk catching a chill, or worse, you might step in something unpleasant. So what did people actually do? Chamber pots, urine buckets, in the corner. Many households kept a simple life-saving object near the bed. A chamber pot, usually made from clay, wood, or even old leather. This humble item was your best bet when nature called in the middle of the night. You'd crouch or hover over it, do your business, and set it aside. In the morning, someone, often a child, would take it out and dump the contents. These weren't glamorous. They didn't have lids or odor control. And yes, in a shared sleeping space, everyone knew when someone used it. If you didn't instead have a proper pot, you might improvise. A wooden bowl, a section of hollowed log, a corner of the barn, especially for urine, even the mud floor, quickly covered with straw. Yes, really, it was dirty. It was smelly, but it beat going outside, night soil, waste disposal, and morning chores. Once the sun rose, or at least once people stirred, the night's bodily waste had to go somewhere. This task often fell to the younger or lower-ranking members of the household. The pot was carried outside, carefully, trying not to spill. Contents were dumped in the latrine pit, the dung heap, or into a trench behind the house. In towns, chamber pots were emptied into open gutters, which carried the muck down the street. Some peasants, especially women, kept rags or bundles of straw nearby to clean themselves. Toilet paper didn't exist. Water, not at night, unless you melted snow. And during deep winter, the pot contents might freeze solid overnight, making emptying it an even less pleasant experience. Worse for women. Let's not ignore the gender divide. Medieval women had more complex needs at night, especially during menstruation or childbirth. They might keep cloth pads or bundles of moss or straw near the bed. During their period, blood-soaked rags were rinsed in cold water the next morning, if any was available. If they gave birth during the night, everything fluids, afterbirth, pain, played out in the same space where everyone slept. Privacy? Not a thing. And for peasant women who just had a child in winter, the risk of infection, fever, or hemorrhage was terrifyingly high. Do your business before bed. Because nighttime was so inconvenient and gross, peasants learned to plan ahead. Parents told their children, relieve yourself before the fire dies. No one wanted to deal with frozen mud, startled animals, or icy feet at 2 a.m. Some even had superstitions around holding in urine, fearing it caused fevers or bad humors, but others just learned to tough it out. There are records of peasants, even older adults, wetting themselves at night from cold or exhaustion, and no one making a fuss about it. That's just how it was. The smell of winter nights. You might imagine that cold air killed the stink, but in truth, medieval peasant homes had an aroma. Between the smoke from damp firewood, the must of wool and straw, the manure dragged in on boots, the chamber pot in the corner, the farts and sweat of half a dozen bodies. Let's just say, winter nights weren't fresh and crisp inside those huts. Even with frost on the windows, the inside of a peasant home smelled like a barn, crossed with a stable, crossed with a steam room. And yet, this was normal. People got used to it. They didn't complain. This was survival. Let's talk about medieval hygiene, but in the dead of winter, because even in the best of times, staying clean in the Middle Ages wasn't easy. But when the temperature dropped below freezing and water turned to ice in the bucket overnight, bathing and body care became a whole different game. Did medieval peasants bathe in winter? Short answer, rarely. Long answer, water was cold, firewood was precious, and people weren't eager to strip down and splash themselves when the wind could slice through wool. Here's steps what it looked like in practice. Full-body baths were rare, even in warm seasons. In winter, most peasants gave up bathing entirely for weeks or months. If you absolutely had to clean up, say after childbirth, or for a holiday, you might warm a small bucket of water near the hearth and do a sponge bath. For some, the best you could hope for was wiping your face, hands, and maybe your feet. Forget showers. Forget hot baths. Forget soap lather and steam. Staying warm was more important than staying clean. Hair, beards, and body odor. Hair care took a winter-specific turn too. Women often braided their hair tightly and left it that way for days. Men might shave with a sharp knife or let their beards grow all winter for warmth. Washing hair was rare. Cold water on the scalp could lead to chills or fevers. Lice were common, and delousing was a family affair by the firelight. As for smell, people didn't expect anyone to smell good. They just hoped no one smelled too bad. A strong body odor meant you were working, alive, and surviving. To mask scent, some rubbed themselves with herbs like rosemary, lavender, or sage if available. Wood ash, animal fat, mixed with fragrant plants, but most just lived with it. Hands, feet, and teeth. Winter changed how peasants handled the little things too. Hands. You worked with them all day, splitting wood, milking goats, carrying water. Washing them was instead always possible. Some wiped hands on straw or aprons after meals or messy work. Feet. The feet were crucial. Cold feet meant misery, or worse, frostbite. Peasants wore wool wrappings or multiple layers of cloth instead of socks. Foot washing was almost non-existent in winter. If your feet got wet, you dry them by the fire. If you were lucky. Teeth. Toothbrushes? No. Toothpaste? No. Mouthwash? Definitely no. People sometimes chewed twigs to clean their teeth or rubbed ash on their gums. Most relied on luck, strong enamel, and low-sugar diets. Bad breath was instead a deal-breaker. Everyone had it. Winter hygiene myths. There were also plenty of medieval beliefs about winter and cleanliness that sound strange to us now. Washing too often was dangerous. Many believed that warm water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to illness. This was especially feared in winter, when colds and floods were rampant. Cold kept you cleaner. It was assumed that without sweat, dirt wasn't as much of a problem, so you could hold off bathing for a few months. Steam was suspicious. In some regions, it was thought that letting hot water or steam touch the skin during cold months was inviting disease in through the skin. So while monks in monasteries might wash more regularly, if they had access to heated water, peasants mostly did without. Living with dirt, sharing the load. It's worth repeating, cleanliness wasn't a personal virtue in medieval village life. It was a luxury, and if you were a peasant, it was mostly about endurance. No one expected you to be fresh. No one scolded you for grime under your nails. Being clean in winter just meant you didn't stink too badly. You weren't set covered in manure. You didn't have lice right now. Everyone in the house shared in the challenge. Kids were just as crusty as adults. Elders might be too stiff to wash at all, and if you lived near animals, which many peasants did, you accepted their smell as part of your own. The fire was the bathroom, the mirror, the medicine. The center of this winter routine was the hearth. It wasn't set just for cooking and warmth. It was where you warmed water for sponge baths, boiled cloths to wash wounds or babies, picked lice out of your hair by firelight, cauterized wounds or pulled teeth, sat to soothe sore joints or dry out damp clothes. There were no mirrors. You didn't look at your reflection unless you found still water or polished metal. You knew how you looked by how others looked at you or didn't. Now imagine it's the middle of a freezing night. Your body aches, you've got chills, a cough, and your head feels like it's full of smoke. You're a medieval peasant, and you're getting sick. What happens next is in medicine, is in survival. No doctors, just guesswork. Let's start with the obvious. There were no hospitals in your village, no clinics, no trained doctors on call. You had the village-wise woman, midwife, or herbalist, if you were lucky. Old wives' tales passed down through generations, a priest for spiritual illnesses, and whatever nature or desperation could provide. When someone got sick, the family responded with a combination of instinct, superstition, and anything that had worked once before. What caused illness in winter? No one knew about germs. Disease wasn't seen as microbial. It was spiritual, environmental, or humoral. Common beliefs. Cold itself caused sickness. Breathing too much cold air could give you a fever, for wet hair in winter was dangerous. Sleeping too close to a draft could kill you. Bad air miasma was another suspect. If the air smelled bad, it was considered poisoned. Imbalance of humors. The body was thought to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one of these was out of balance, too much phlegm in winter, you got ill. There was also belief in curses, evil spirits, or divine punishment. If someone died suddenly or suffered an unusual illness, it might be blamed on sin, a neighbor's curse, or a visitation from the devil. What was considered a normal illness? If yours accepts what people expected to face during winter: coughs, congestion and fever, sometimes fatal, toothaches and gum disease, lice infestations, skin infections from scratches or frostbite, joint pain, arthritis, or winter stiffness, childbirth complications. The elderly were especially vulnerable. So were young children. And if you were already malnourished or weak, even a mild illness could spiral quickly. Home remedies and survival tactics. If someone fell ill, the family didn't just give up. They did what they could. Warm the person with extra blankets, heated stones, or a spot by the hearth. Herbal brews made from sage, thyme, elderflower, garlic, and honey were popular. Onions or garlic might be worn around the neck to draw out illness. Bloodletting or leeching was rare among peasants, but not unheard of if someone with a little education insisted on it. Prayer and penance were used to treat spiritual sickness. Some people confessed sins hoping their health would return. None of this was guaranteed to work, but it gave people something to do, and sometimes the body healed on its own. When it got serious, if someone's condition worsened, a few things could happen. They were left to rest. There were no antibiotics, no IV drips. If someone had a fever or infection, they were given warmth, maybe herbal tea, and time. Neighbors might help. Other families might pitch in with food, firewood, or help with chores. If death seemed likely, a priest was called, not to cure, but to give last rites. This was seen as preparing the soul for the afterlife. For the rest of the household, life kept going. Cows needed milking. Bread had to be baked. Firewood had to be gathered. Grief was real, but so was the need to survive the next day. And when someone died, here's the harsh truth. People died at home, quietly, in their sleep, in pain, surrounded by family, or alone by the hearth. There were no funeral homes. The family handled the body. It was washed, usually by women in the household, laid out in simple clothes or a shroud, buried in the local churchyard. Often the next day, in the dead of winter, digging a grave was grueling. Sometimes people were buried in shallow plots or held in temporary shelters until the ground thawed. There wasn't always a marker. There wasn't always a priest, but the village remembered, living with death and keeping going. Death wasn't a rare, shocking event. It was part of life. Children died. Elders died. Sometimes a healthy adult just never woke up, and when that happened, peasants didn't collapse. They carried on because they had no choice. They couldn't stop from mourning. There was firewood to chop, bread to bake, animals to feed, other mouths to keep alive. And when night fell and the wind howled outside, they gathered by the hearth, maybe one person fewer than the night before, and did it all again. Let's zoom in on the most ordinary moment of medieval peasant life. The hours right after sunset. The animals are fed, the tools are stored, the sun has disappeared behind the hills, and now the long night begins. Who runs the house now? Not the Lord, not the clergy, not even the men, most of the time. In the dark hours between sunset and sleep, the ones who truly kept a medieval peasant household running were the women and the children. This was their domain. And every night they worked silently, without applause, keeping everyone warm, fed, and alive. What night work looked like. We tend to imagine medieval people doing hard labor in the fields and then collapsing into bed. But the end of field work wasn't the end of work. It was just the start of another kind. Here are steps what usually happened in the hours after sundown. Dinner prep, often a thick grain porridge, broth or leftover bread. Mending clothes, repairing tools, milking animals, especially in winter when daylight was short, spinning wool or flax by firelight, sweeping ashes, cleaning out the hearth, tending sick family members or small children, heating stones or bricks for warming beds. In small homes with a single shared room, none of this was private. It all happened in the same space, under the smoky thatch, beside the fire, often with babies nursing and dogs curled near the door. The hearth was everything. The hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was the beating heart of the house. Everything happened around it. It provided light, the only real light at night, warmth, especially in bitter cold, protection, a fire that never fully went out, a place to dry wet clothing or warm chilled limbs, a spot for conversation, storytelling, and song. Women managed the hearth. They kept the fire alive. Literally, they stirred the coals at dawn. They used smoldering embers to light the next day's cooking. They knew when to feed it and when to let it rest. In many ways, they were like living calendars, knowing when to soak lentils, when to set the dough to rise, when the water would boil, when the fire needed ash. Children had night jobs too. Childhood in the Middle Ages didn't mean playtime. It meant contribution. Even after sunset, children weren't set idle. In winter, they might fetch kindling from outside, hold the candle while a mother sewed or spun, turn a spit if meat was roasting, watch younger siblings, tidy rushes on the floor, rub ointment into a goat sip's hooves, or help check for lice. Children often slept close to the hearth, both for warmth and because they were useful there, and listening to adult talk and stories gave them a kind of informal education. They learned what herbs to use for fevers, what to do if a chicken refused to lay, how to tell if a neighbor was lying. It was the medieval version of bedtime stories, except the stories were practical, grim, and often true. The unspoken knowledge. What held all this together wasn't written rules, it was unspoken understanding. Women passed knowledge to daughters and daughters-in-law. Girls learned to bake before they could read. Boys learned to check for mold on stored grain before they could write their name. Every woman knew the signs of a fire that was about to go out. Every child knew which parts of the floor were warmest in winter. There were no instruction manuals, just hands, voices, routines. And once the fire was banked and the family huddled under shared wool blankets, the room grew still until morning when the whole cycle started again. Let's set the scene. The fire is low, glowing softly. Outside, frost settles on the fields. Inside, a woman sits near the hearth, spindle in hand, working silently. She's not just passing the time, she's spinning the threads that will one day become a tunic, a blanket, or the cord that ties a bundle of herbs. She's producing survival, one thread at a time. This quiet, repetitive work filled countless medieval nights, and it was almost always done by women. The tools were simple, but the skill was not. Before spinning wheels became common in later centuries, most women used a drop spindle, a rod weighted with a disc or whirl at the bottom. She'd take a handful of wool or flax, twist the fibers into thread with her fingers, let the spindle spin and pull the thread down, then wind it up and do it again, over and over, for hours. The fibers had to be cleaned, teased, and carded first, another long process. And all of this happened while keeping an eye on the fire, answering questions from children, checking on simmering food, and listening for animals outside. Multitasking wasn't a modern invention, it was a survival skill. Spinning wasn't just household work, it was economic work. In many villages, women's spinning was the backbone of the local economy. A family's ability to clothe itself, especially in the cold, relied on how much thread the women could spin during winter months. In some places, peasants were required to pay rent or taxes with spun thread or woven cloth. Others sold their extra thread to traders or neighbors, or bartered it for eggs, soap, or milk. And while men sometimes wove cloth, especially in guilds or for sale, spinning was seen as women's work and often dismissed as domestic or unskilled. But in truth, a woman who couldn't spin enough thread in winter could leave her entire household exposed to cold, debt, or shame. The stakes were quiet but real. Stories, songs, and secrets. The spinning hours weren't always silent. Women often worked together in small groups, especially in winter. They gathered at one another's hearths, especially widows or single women who lived alone. They told stories, some moral, some bawdy, some just funny. They sang spinning songs, often in rhythm with the spindle's drop and twist. They passed on healing recipes, advice about childbirth, how to deal with a cruel husband, or when a certain neighbor might be stealing your firewood. This was the oral network of medieval rural life. News, wisdom, and warnings spread around hearths, not from pulpits. And if a young girl sat quietly in the corner, pretending to sleep, she heard everything. Night wasn't set, time off, it was time stolen. Modern people often imagine that pre-electricity life ended at sunset. But here's the thing, the dark hours weren't for sleeping, they were for stealing back time. Time to do the things daylight work didn't set allow. That's what spinning was. Time borrowed from the fire, from the body, from sleep. Not optional, not relaxing. When moralists and clerics criticized women's chatter or gatherings in the evenings, what they really feared was that this world of spinning and stories created its own rules, its own values, and its own hierarchy, one in which men were rarely invited. Because at night, around the hearth, women were in charge, and while the rest of the village slept, they kept the house alive. Now let's talk about sleep. Not the soft, cozy, personal kind we know today. Medieval peasant sleep was something else entirely. It was communal, functional, and strategic, a nightly negotiation of bodies, warmth, and space. There were no bedrooms, no mattresses, just one dark room, one fire, and too many limbs. The fire came first. Before anyone could think of sleep, the hearth had to be prepped. Embers were carefully banked, piled with ashes to smother the flames, but keep the coals hot until morning. If the fire died completely, restarting it wasn't easy. Most peasants didn't have flint or matches. Fire was passed from house to house like a living inheritance. So one person, often the mother, made sure the coals were alive. She'd sometimes place a heavy earthenware pot over them, or cover them with dung bricks or wet peat to help them smolder longer. That fire wasn't just heat. It was protection. It was food. It was everything. Letting it die meant waking up cold or not waking up at all. A family quilt of bodies. Then came sleep. There weren't enough beds for everyone. Most families had one bed, if any. Others just had pallets made from straw or old cloth, laid on wooden boards or the packed dirt floor. Everyone bundled in together, parents, children, grandparents, even the baby goat or a sick chicken if it needed warmth. Clothes stayed on, blankets were rare. Instead, people layered everything they had: tunics, cloaks, sacks, even reeds stuffed in linen. Children slept sideways or between adults to soak up warmth. Toddlers were placed closest to the fire, but with a careful barrier so they didn't roll in. It wasn't just about comfort, it was body heat strategy. Noisy, smelly, and not exactly private. Forget the idea of a peaceful medieval slumber. You've got snoring, coughing, a baby crying, someone shifting, the chickens rustling, maybe an old man having night sweats or a child who wet the straw. Flatulence was not optional, and if someone had garlic at dinner, the whole bed knew. But privacy? That wasn't a state, even a concept. Sex, for example, still happened, but discreetly, under blankets, with children pretending not to notice. Or maybe they did notice, and just didn't mention it. Life was like that. And if a family took in a traveler, or had a poor cousin staying over, they'd sleep in the same room too, bodies stacked like firewood, making do. Night wasn't set always safe. Even inside, sleep came with risk. Roaming animals could break in. Fires could flare back up. A windstorm might tear off the thatch. A drunk neighbor might come pounding on the door. That's why people slept lightly, and often in shifts. Someone, usually the mother or eldest daughter, kept an ear out for the fire, for thieves, for wolves, for screams. It was a kind of hyper-vigilant rest, not total surrender, but recovery. And through it all, the room stayed alive with warmth, from the hearth, from the breath of animals, from the bodies pressed close together. That's how people survived the night. Not alone, never alone, but tangled up in a mess of family, sweat, love, fear, and firelight. So that's how they did it. Not with comfort, not with central heating or fleece-lined socks, but with instinct, ritual, and a stubborn refusal to give in to the cold. From snow-packed thatch to peat smoke breath, from straw beds shared with goats to candle-stub prayers whispered in the dark, medieval peasants didn't just endure the coldest nights. They made a kind of life inside them. It wasn't soft. It wasn't fair. It certainly wasn't quiet. But it worked. And as strange as it seems now, there's something deeply human in that struggle, in the way families huddled together, not just for warmth, but for survival, in the way they layered habits on habits until a fragile kind of routine took shape. The cold came every year, but so did sunrise, and that somehow was enough. Historical sleep notes. If you're still awake, if you's beer drifting off by now, that sep's perfect. But if you stir still listening, here's but a few closing thoughts to let your mind gently wander. Most peasants didn't know their exact age, but they felt each winter in their bones. The older you were, the harder the cold hit. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were often seen as literal spirits pressing down on your chest, night hags or demons in the folklore of the time. People really believed sleep could kill. Some houses had charms, bits of bone, old shoes, bits of woven cloth, hidden in the walls to ward off winter spirits. These weren't just decoration, They were insurance policies. And despite everything, people laughed, even at night, around the fire, telling stories, making rude jokes, singing, because that's what got them through. Not just firewood, but each other. Fade out. So now, whether you're curled up in flannel sheets or just listening with your eyes half closed, you've time traveled through the kind of night most people today can't imagine, and yet millions once lived through year after year. I've walked barefoot across cold packed dirt. You've banked the fire. You've layered every tunic you own just to get through till morning. And now, it's steps time to rest. Good night.